The renovation crew had already been working for 2 full days inside Coastal Bloom's flower shop when the discovery happened, the kind of moment that freezes time and changes a place forever. It was August 12th, 2024, a quiet summer afternoon in the small California coastal town of Seaside. The shop, known for its pastel storefront and fragrant displays, was temporarily closed while contractors upgraded its aging refrigeration system to meet new health code standards. The job was expected to be routine, nothing more than removing insulation, replacing outdated cooling units, and sealing everything back up before reopening to customers. No one expected that the walls of the flower shop were hiding a secret that had been buried for 15 years. Mike Stevens, a 39-year-old contractor with 15 years of experience renovating small businesses along the California coast, had been assigned to remove insulated panels behind the main cooler. He had worked on dozens of restaurants, bakeries, and floral shops over the years, and Coastal Blooms appeared no different. The shop had been operating since 1998, and its infrastructure showed every bit of its age. Mike and his crew had started the project on August 10th, 2024, expecting a straightforward 3-day job. Everything had gone according to plan until that Tuesday afternoon, when Mike noticed something that didn't make sense. As he pried loose one of the insulated wall panels, the resistance felt wrong. The wall seemed thicker than it should have been, the insulation deeper, denser. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and leaned closer, shining his work light into the narrow opening he had created. Behind the panel wasn't empty space or exposed piping. There was another wall, another sealed area, something that didn't exist on any of the architectural blueprints. "Wait," Mike said, his voice sharp with confusion as he turned to his crew member Tom, who had worked with him for 5 years. "There's something back here. This doesn't match the plans at all." Tom stepped closer, peering over Mike's shoulder. As Mike removed more insulation and pried away the final panel, the opening widened enough to reveal a small enclosed space, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. It looked like a compact walk-in freezer, completely sealed off, with no visible entrance. The air that spilled out was cold, stale, and unnatural, carrying a faint metallic scent that made Mike's stomach tighten. He raised his flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam illuminated a human skeleton standing upright, leaning against the back wall as if frozen in place. Draped over the bones was a green floral apron, its fabric stiff with age, embroidered with the familiar Coastal Blooms logo. Surrounding the remains were dozens of dried, blackened roses scattered across the concrete floor, their petals long stripped of color and fragrance. Beside the skeleton lay a pair of professional florist scissors, rusted with time, and several spools of ribbon, yellowed and brittle. Mike staggered back, his hands trembling, his breath catching in his throat. "My God," he whispered, "call the police right now, don't touch anything." Within 15 minutes, the Seaside Police Department arrived. 2 patrol cars pulled up outside the shop, lights flashing against the pastel storefront, followed closely by an unmarked sedan driven by Detective Corinne Miller. At 42 years old, with 18 years of law enforcement experience, Miller understood immediately that this was no ordinary discovery. Small coastal towns like Seaside carried their history quietly, and when secrets surfaced, they cut deep. The shop was secured as a crime scene. Forensic teams entered carefully, photographing every angle of the sealed cold storage room, measuring distances, collecting samples from the walls, floor, and remains. The skeleton was positioned upright, leaning slightly to the left. There was obvious blunt force trauma to the left side of the skull, with multiple impact points suggesting repeated strikes. Clothing remnants included the green floral apron, faded jeans, and canvas sneakers. A silver wristwatch remained on the left wrist, its hand stopped at exactly 6:50 p.m., a silent marker of the moment everything ended. "Florist," Detective Miller said quietly, kneeling beside the remains. "Worked here. Let's dig into this shop's history, everything." As the investigation unfolded, one name rose immediately from the records: Violet Morgan, 25 years old, flower shop employee, disappeared on May 2, 2009. Detective Miller pulled the thick archived case file from storage later that evening. The original investigation had been handled by Detective James Cooper, now retired and living in San Diego. Miller called him as soon as she finished reviewing the preliminary forensic findings. "Violet Morgan," Cooper said slowly over the phone, his voice heavy with memory. "I'm 67 now and I never forgot that case. Sweet girl, incredible with flowers. Customers adored her. She disappeared while preparing a big wedding order. We searched everywhere for months, never found a trace." "Anyone suspicious at the time?" Miller asked carefully. There was a pause on the line. "Her coworker," Cooper said, "Linda Crawford. She took over many of Violet's responsibilities after she vanished. She seemed genuinely upset during questioning. No red flags back then." DNA analysis moved quickly. Violet's mother, Diane Morgan, now 68 years old, still lived in Seaside, just 2 miles from the shop. When detectives contacted her, her hands shook as she agreed to provide a reference sample. 1 week later, the results came back. A perfect match. The remains sealed inside the cold storage room were confirmed as Violet Marie Morgan. Violet had been born on March 18, 1984 in California, the youngest of 3 children in a loving family. She grew up in Seaside, surrounded by ocean air and blooming gardens. From an early age, flowers fascinated her. She spent hours helping her mother in the garden, learning names, textures, colors, and scents, arranging blossoms into small, thoughtful designs. Her talent was natural, instinctive. At 17, she created her first professional bouquet for a neighbor's wedding, and word spread quickly that she had something special. After graduating high school in 2002, Violet enrolled in a local community college floristry course. She chose hands-on learning over university, determined to build her craft through experience. In 2006, at age 22, she was hired by Coastal Bloom's flower shop. Owner Richard Blake saw her potential immediately. She didn't just arrange flowers, she told stories with them. Weddings, funerals, anniversaries, each piece reflected care, emotion, and precision. Customers began requesting her by name. "That girl is amazing," they told Richard. "She just understands what we want." Within 3 years, Violet became the shop's most valued employee. In 2008, she got engaged to Jake Turner, a local fisherman she met at a community event. They bought a small apartment, adopted a golden retriever named Daisy, and planned to marry in the summer of 2010. But behind the scenes, jealousy was growing. Linda Crawford had worked at Coastal Bloom since 1997. Born in 1967, she had lived a difficult life, married young, divorced by 25, raising 2 children alone while working minimum-wage jobs. Reliable but unremarkable, Linda had never been considered for advancement. When Violet arrived, everything changed. Praise shifted. Responsibility shifted. Attention shifted. In April 2009, Richard Blake told Linda privately that he was considering making Violet assistant manager. Linda smiled and nodded, but inside, something broke. On May 2, 2009, Violet stayed late preparing a massive wedding order. At 6:45 p.m., Linda called her to the cold storage room for help. What happened next would remain hidden for 15 years. And the flowers never stopped selling. The cold storage room felt unnaturally quiet as Violet stepped inside that evening, the hum of refrigeration surrounding her, the air sharp against her skin. The light inside wasn't working, leaving the space dim and shadowed. Cold air drifted out into the hallway behind her as she turned back toward Linda, who stood just outside the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Where exactly are the boxes?" Violet asked, scanning the shelves. Linda didn't answer immediately. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure Violet could hear it. 12 years of resentment, disappointment, and quiet bitterness surged through her all at once. Every compliment Violet had ever received echoed in her mind. Every time Richard relied on Violet instead of her. Every time customers smiled and said Violet's name. For just a second, Linda hesitated. Then she made her decision. Leaning against the wall inside the storage room was a heavy metal rod, normally used to move large potted plants and heavy deliveries. Linda grabbed it with both hands and swung with everything she had. The impact landed on the back of Violet's head with a dull, sickening sound. Violet collapsed forward onto the concrete floor, disoriented, confused, blood beginning to pool beneath her. "Linda, why?" Violet whispered, barely conscious. Linda didn't answer. Panic surged through her body, adrenaline overriding reason. She struck again, and again, each blow harder than the last. Violet stopped moving. The room fell silent except for Linda's ragged breathing. She dropped the rod and knelt beside Violet, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she checked for a pulse. There was nothing. Violet Morgan was dead. Linda stumbled backward, pressing herself against the cold wall, her mind racing. She had killed someone. A young woman who had trusted her, worked beside her, helped her whenever she asked. The reality threatened to crush her, but then another thought surfaced, cold and clear. This fixed everything. If Violet disappeared, there would be no promotion, no assistant manager. The position would fall to Linda by default. The shop would need stability, someone reliable, someone experienced, someone who had been there for years. Linda moved quickly, driven by fear and a twisted sense of survival. The cold storage room had an unused back section, leftover space from an earlier expansion of the shop. It had never been properly finished, partially sealed off and forgotten. Linda dragged Violet's body into that dark space, her arms straining, her breath coming in gasps. She positioned Violet upright against the back wall, unsure why she did it that way, only knowing she couldn't leave her lying on the floor. Then she began building. She found insulation panels, industrial adhesive, screws. Everything she needed was already in the shop. Working methodically through the night, Linda sealed the space completely, panel by panel, smoothing seams, reinforcing the wall until it looked permanent, untouched, as though it had always been there. By the time she finished, the sky outside was beginning to lighten. Linda cleaned obsessively. She wiped every trace of blood with bleach, scrubbing until her hands burned. She cleaned the metal rod until it gleamed. She returned Violet's workstation to exactly how it had been, fresh flowers arranged carefully on the table, scissors left open mid-cut, ribbon spools unrolled, Violet's coffee mug still half full. It looked like Violet had simply stepped away. At 5:00 a.m., Linda drove home, showered for nearly an hour, and sat on her bed staring at the wall as Violet's face replayed in her mind. She told herself she had no choice now. What was done was done. The next morning, Jake Turner tried calling Violet repeatedly. There was no answer. Confused and worried, he drove to Coastal Blooms. Violet's car was still in the parking lot. Her purse was inside. Her phone was on the work table, but Violet was gone. Police were called immediately. Detective James Cooper arrived and searched the shop thoroughly. Everything looked normal, too normal. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no forced entry. Violet had simply vanished. Linda was questioned extensively. She appeared distraught, tearful, convincing. "I left around 7, she said. "My kids needed dinner. Violet was still working. She said she'd lock up." Searches began immediately. Police and volunteers combed the coastline, nearby forests, abandoned buildings. Search dogs tracked Violet, sent to the parking lot, then lost it completely. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. There was nothing. Jake Turner was devastated. Diane Morgan refused to accept that her daughter was gone forever. She clung to hope even as the years passed. Linda stepped into Violet's role seamlessly. She told customers how much she missed her. She took on more responsibility. Within months, she was assistant manager. Within 2 years, full manager. For 15 years, Linda ran Coastal Blooms, arranging weddings, greeting customers, smiling kindly at Diane whenever she came into the shop, all while knowing Violet's frozen body was sealed behind the wall just feet away. Until August 12, 2024. When Mike Stevens broke through that wall, the lie collapsed. Detective Karen Miller worked closely with genetic genealogy specialist Dr. Emma Park. Forensic analysis recovered trace DNA from Violet's bones and clothing, skin cells and biological material left behind when the body was moved and sealed. The DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases. 3 weeks later, a match appeared. Linda Crawford. On September 5, 2024, Detective Miller arrived at Linda's home with 2 officers. Linda opened the door looking older than her 57 years, her shoulders sagging. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said quietly. At the station, Linda confessed. She spoke of jealousy, rage, regret. She described that night in detail, the attack, the wall, the lie. "I've lived with her ghost for 15 years, she said through tears. "Every flower reminded me of her." The town of Seaside was stunned, and justice was finally coming. The confession Linda Crawford gave that night was quiet, detailed, and devastating. Sitting across from Detective Karen Miller in the interrogation room, her hands folded tightly in front of her, Linda spoke as though she had been waiting 15 years to finally tell the truth. There was no anger left in her voice, no attempt to excuse herself, only exhaustion and resignation. She described the jealousy that had consumed her, how every compliment Violet received felt like another reminder of everything Linda believed she had lost. She talked about that moment in the cold storage room, how it had happened so fast and yet had replayed in her mind every single day since. "I didn't wake up planning to do it," Linda said softly, tears sliding down her face. "But once I did it, I knew there was no going back. I sealed her in that room, and I sealed myself in with her. I just kept pretending I was alive." Detective Miller listened without interrupting, knowing the weight of those words would matter later in court. Linda described building the wall, cleaning the shop, taking over Violet's responsibilities, and slowly shaping a career that should have belonged to someone else. She admitted that every success felt hollow, every wedding arrangement felt like a reminder of what she had done. She said she had considered turning herself in countless times, but was terrified of losing everything and facing the truth. The arrest sent shockwaves through Seaside. News spread quickly through the small coastal town. Customers who had known Linda for years struggled to reconcile the friendly florist they trusted with the crime she had committed. People gathered outside Coastal Blooms, standing silently, staring at the building that had unknowingly held Violet Morgan's body for 15 years. Many cried. Some were angry. Most were simply stunned. Diane Morgan held a press conference outside her home, her hands shaking as she spoke. "My daughter trusted Linda," she said, her voice breaking. "They worked together every day. Violet believed in her, and Linda murdered her over a job. For 15 years, I thanked her for continuing Violet's work. I bought flowers from her for Violet's birthday. I trusted my daughter's killer without knowing." Jake Turner, Violet's fiancé, did not speak publicly. Friends said he withdrew completely after the arrest, overwhelmed by grief that resurfaced all over again. He had built a life after Violet's disappearance, but the discovery reopened wounds he had never fully healed. Knowing Violet had been so close all along, frozen behind a wall while life moved on outside, was almost unbearable. The trial began in October 2024. The courtroom was filled every day. Former customers, longtime residents, and members of the community attended, many sitting quietly, clutching tissues, listening as prosecutors laid out the story piece by piece. The prosecution emphasized the motive, the opportunity, and the years of deception that followed the murder. They showed photographs of the sealed cold storage room, the floral apron, the dried blackened roses scattered across the floor like a cruel memorial. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence, explaining how trace material recovered from Violet's remains had survived years of freezing temperatures and had ultimately led investigators to Linda through genetic genealogy. Dr. Emma Park explained the science carefully, ensuring the jury understood that the match was definitive, not circumstantial. The defense attempted to argue that the killing was not premeditated, that it was a moment of emotional collapse driven by jealousy and stress rather than careful planning. They acknowledged the act but asked the jury to consider Linda's difficult life and the absence of a prior criminal record. But the prosecution countered by highlighting the hours Linda spent sealing the wall, cleaning the scene, and maintaining the lie for 15 years. This wasn't a mistake followed by panic, they argued. This was a choice repeated every single day afterward. Linda took the stand in her own defense. Her voice trembled as she spoke about Violet, describing her talent, her kindness, and how deeply she regretted what she had done. "I stole her life," she said, "and then I stole her future. I lived in the place she should have been. I know there's no forgiveness for that." After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. There was no audible reaction in the courtroom when the verdict was read, just quiet sobs and bowed heads. Diane closed her eyes and exhaled, as though she had been holding her breath for 15 years. Linda stood motionless, tears streaming down her face, accepting the outcome without protest. At the sentencing hearing, Diane spoke again, standing just a few feet from the woman who had taken her daughter's life. "Linda built her entire career on my daughter's frozen corpse," she said. "She smiled at me, hugged me, and comforted me while knowing Violet was behind that wall. She deserves every day of her punishment." The judge sentenced Linda Crawford to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. At 57 years old, she would not be eligible for parole until she was 77, and even then, release was unlikely. Linda nodded as the sentence was read, her voice barely audible when she spoke. "I deserve this," she said. "Violet didn't deserve what I did to her. I'll carry that forever." Following the trial, Coastal Blooms closed temporarily. When it reopened under new ownership, the name was changed to Violet's Blooms. A bronze plaque was installed near the entrance, reading Violet Morgan, 1984-2009. Created beauty and art with flowers, touched every life she met, never forgotten. Customers often stopped to read it, some leaving flowers beneath it, others standing silently in remembrance. The cold storage room was permanently sealed and removed from use. The shop underwent renovations, ensuring no hidden spaces remained. Diane was invited to a private reopening ceremony, where she placed a single white rose on the counter in honor of her daughter. "She would have loved this," she said quietly. Detective Corinne Miller later reflected on the case in interviews, emphasizing how easily trust can be weaponized. "Killers are sometimes the people we work beside every day," she said. "People we share coffee breaks with, people we think we know. This case reminds us that the truth can be hidden in plain sight for years." For Seaside, healing came slowly. The betrayal cut deep, but Violet's story became one of remembrance rather than silence. Her talent, kindness, and love for flowers were finally honored openly. Weddings once again filled the shop with laughter, anniversaries were celebrated with bouquets, and life continued, this time without lies behind the walls. Violet Morgan was finally laid to rest properly, surrounded by family, friends, and the community that had never stopped missing her. 15 years late but not forgotten. Her legacy lived on in every arrangement, every bloom, and every moment of beauty created in her name. If this story moved you, please subscribe and hit the like button. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that victims like Violet are never forgotten. Comment below with the case you'd like us to cover next and where you're watching from.